So our conference is called Sensing Spaces, Perceiving Place. But I want to bring in design as well as perception. And so I'm going to be talking about how we go from sensing places to designing spaces. And I'm going to bring wayfinding, memory, and imagination into the mix. Now, unfortunately, we only have time for the tip of the iceberg. So if you'd like to learn more about this, next year there will be a book called When Brains Meet Buildings that does the whole thing in great detail. The inspiration for this talk actually comes from a quote from Peter Zumthor, who talked about construction as the art of making a meaningful whole out of many parts. But more specifically, bringing in memory and imagination, he talked about the way in which old half-forgotten memories come together in some way to yield new ideas, new images for his design. Now, in the book, I have two case studies. One is looking at Jørn Utsen's design of the Sydney Opera House, the other at Geary's design of the Bilbao Guggenheim. But I'm not going to go into those case studies because in the time we have, I'm just going to concentrate on the principles. So what I'm working on these days is a large model called IBSEN, short for Imagination in Brain Systems for Episodes and Navigation. And what I'm trying to give you then is an example of model theory building in computational cognitive neuroscience, which is informed by both animal and human brain data. The underlying principle, though, for ANFA is the suggestion that as we understand the brain mechanisms involved in the experience of architecture, that in some sense we have to invert those to find the neural processes for imagination in the design of architecture. In one case, you're going from what's out there to some mental images. In the other case, you're developing mental images and going out there to plans for the external world. So the first set of concepts I want to introduce are thinking about perception, in this case visual perception, as a form of mental construction. These are old examples from a visions system, but if we go from the top image to the second image, what has happened is the process of segmentation, trying to find borders that divide the thing into regions that might possibly be interpreted. And then to get to the interpretation, shown in the bottom, we bring in something called perceptual schemas. These are routines, whether in the brain or the computer, for making sense of what we are seeing, whether it's based on the local cues or on the context. So in particular, if we look at the sky, this is purely based on the data. We talk of bottom-up, going up from the data to the interpretation. It's a large region, it's the right sort of color, it's at the top of the image, so it's sky. Roof is interesting because it combines the data on shape and size with the top-down context. The idea that because it's in the right position relative to what we think is the sky, that increases the chance that it's roof. So the implication for imagination is that whereas these processes of competition and cooperation go up from the data in the image, in imagination, they're initiated top-down with little or no sensory input. So that's our first big concept, top-down cues that generate images. Now, if there's one region that I think this community has heard about in the brain, it's the hippocampus. And at left, we see the famous example of place cells in the hippocampus. The red dots show positions where the rat is as it runs around an arena, positions where that particular cell they're recording from in the hippocampus is activated. And unfortunately, though, many people in our community believe that these data show that the hippocampus does navigation. Whereas what I'm going to show you later in this talk is that it takes many brain regions to work together to solve the navigation problem. For the moment, let's concentrate on the human data, the particular case study of HM, who suffered massive epilepsy, and his surgeon, rather than coming up with a delicate operation, just whacked out a huge region of his brain, including the hippocampus and related regions. And what is very interesting about this is that it reminded us of how different memory systems can be. He lost episodic memory. He could not remember new events that had happened after the operation. But he had working memory. You could carry on a conversation with him. And he even had procedural memory. He could learn new skills. He just didn't remember the events during which he had been accumulating that expertise. So going back to our Zumta quote, the issue is, how do we link this episodic memory to imagination? And recently, last 10, 15 years, there have been quite a lot of brain imaging studies addressing this. Let me just pick one by Addis and her colleagues. They had people construct narratives, but the idea was they could either be memory, in other words, tell us about the past, or they could be imagination. Imagine what might have happened, might be happening in the future. And they put it into two phases. The event construction was given a cue, begin to think up the ideas for the event, and then elaboration. Okay, spend the rest of the time in the scanner filling in the details to come up with a narrative. Now, obviously, we don't have time to examine the results in detail. So let me just show us one slide to make a couple of points. They were able to distinguish brain activity in the construction phase and the elaboration phase. And the colored bars show that they looked at activity in the brain, both during the past event construction, the future event construction, and some control task. And what you'll see is that of all those little data points, the hippocampus is but one of many other brain regions. And so, again, we make the point that memory and imagination involve more than the hippocampus. The other point, of course, from the HM data is that memory and imagination are not limited to episodic memory, the one in which hippocampus plays an important role, but especially for episodic memory and only in collaboration with other areas. Now, what I want to suggest then, building on this, is that the imagination of events or episodes is a form of mental construction. I've already hinted that in talking about visions. I should just add, of course, that the architect's imagination is not just visual, it's multimodal, it's action-oriented, and initially, at least, not so much constrained by the sensory inputs. It's the top-down constraints that get the process started. The architect's program, perhaps decisions made for other parts of the building, and then we go on with the sort of dynamics that we've begun to chart already in our theories of vision, but now working to create a design. So with this, I think we've said enough to look at the linkage of memory and imagination. What I want to do now is go on to navigation. John O'Keefe, shown here with Lynn Nadell, wrote a famous book called The Hippocampus as a Cognitive Map. And they talk there about two kinds of navigation. One is map-based navigation. And the idea is that for them, it resides in the hippocampus, and then affordance-based route navigation where the hippocampus is not required. So the idea is that you have a memory of an area. If you use that cognitive map in your brain to guide behavior, then the hippocampus is very importantly involved. On the other hand, if you're just, let's say, following a Google map, which just says go to the next corner, turn left, you don't really have a map in your head at all, and the hippocampus isn't required. We modeled that in great detail in previous years, and our world graph model shows that to make the system work, you need many brain regions to work together. Our other model looked at that non-hippocampal substrate. So just to give you a sense, a very brief sense of a world graph, here's an old map, a classic map of the London Underground. And the key components are the nodes, in this case, the train stations, and the edges, in this case, the lines in the railway sense that connect them. So what I'm emphasizing is that we go from a map on paper or on the screen to what's in the brain for a cognitive map. We have not only the information somehow represented in the brain, such as we see here, but also one has to know where one is to get started, where one wants to be, and then to have the mechanisms in one's head to go from that knowledge to come up with a plan. The other concept I need for this part of the talk is the notion of a script. And what I mean is this, that when you're designing a building, you're thinking about people using that building. And you're thinking about the different ways they might behave within that building, whether the behavior is to actively do things or to see the view or whatever. And what I want to add to this with this example is that not only might you be adapting standard scripts, you might be coming up with novel scripts. So here's Lina Bobardi's Sao Paulo Art Museum. As you can see at left, the usual grand entrance up a flight of stairs to impressive doors is missing. Instead, she's put in a space for public events, and at the far end, unobtrusively, stairs and elevators to get up there. And then when you find yourself in the exhibition space, again, a novel script. Instead of the usual script, paintings along the walls, we have here these paintings suspended on glass above concrete blocks, and one wanders around the floor space, finding your way around, having adapted yourself to this unconventional script. Okay, so what I want to offer as the other goal for building this model of what goes on in the brain during design is to think about the brain mechanisms the architect uses to create three-dimensional structures supporting a variety of scripts. So I'm emphasizing that it's not just a matter of what you can see in a photograph. The building's user does not simply contemplate the building, but acts and interacts within and around it. And the spaces engage our senses, invite our actions and our emotions. Unfortunately, I have no time today to get into the subject of emotion. But turning this into the sort of language I've been trying to develop in my model of cognition and cognitive maps, the suggestion is that good architectural design has to offer those significant places, think of those as the nodes, that capture the user's attention and offer aesthetic rewards or serve practical functions, and then also the necessary transitions, those are the edges. So if we go back to my opening title, From Sensing Places to Designing Spaces, we can say that the focus here is on designing spaces to link actions and places. I just use staircases to make this point because with these three very different examples, one totally unattractive at the left, the middle one very famous, and the third, to my mind, the most evocative, we see that we have both the practical of getting from one place to another, and then the two kinds of aesthetic reward possible. One is the contemplation of the staircase itself, the other the views that one might get to by ascending or descending the staircase. The final point I want to make is that as we think about the design of a building and we come up with these various scripts, we're going to have to harmonize them. Consider the diverse scripts for the Sydney Opera House. There's seeing it from the harbour, there's walking toward it from Circular Quay, there's climbing the stairs to enter the auditorium, there's the experiencing of the operas, there's climbing the stairs to reach the upper lobby and view the harbour. And I want to take a moment to pick on those two things of climbing stairs. These are two separate scripts. How do you get up to the auditorium, and how do you get to the lobby to view the harbour? What's interesting, of course, is that in the design, Utzon brought these two into correspondence. So the stairs that go up each side of the auditorium are mounting up to that upper lobby. And of course, which comes first, the harmonizing of the stairs or the placement of the lobby is open to discussion. But that harmonization is crucial. So just to pretty much summarize, scripts combine places with aesthetic and practical affordances, things that they allow the user of the building to do, and the spatial relations between them. The user of the building forms a cognitive map of the scripts it supports. The architect inverts the process. So let's just skip with this to the final slide. What I've tried to show you is that certain cognitive and neural processes may be shared between experience and design, but others require mechanisms that invert the experience. And so skipping below the stars, what I want to emphasize is that we're not in a situation where there's just a bunch of little facts in neuroscience and you just have to plug them in and you get better architecture. I see a real conversation between architecture and neuroscience where we are both encouraging the neuroscientist to discover new things that are interesting, and we're encouraging the architect to understand them better, and then we're encouraging a dynamic conversation between the two when it does come to focusing on the application of some of the neuroscience to improve design. Thank you very much.